I think I can say that since part 2, the carnage level in the shop has exceeded even the usual levels. As I get into it, and I really get into it. So let's see what I've done in the interim since last recorded. The body stays in place now. I've got the pilot holes drilled, just 2.5 millimeter, just setting through just to keep the body in place. The front shock angle is now correct. The rear pinion angle is something that I will address in just a moment here. Let's get this out of the way. I've got some stuff sort of at least temporarily in place. The gearbox is situated. I've been messing with the lock servos to see where they're going to sit. It's going to look something like this, but there's quite a bit of tension on the cables. Due to the nature of these little guys here, the servos, they can't sit all the way in because I hit the motor plate. They have to sit up. So a whole mechanism will have to be built to hold them, then with servo mounts, then with the retentions for the cables themselves. Moving on to other issues on the other side. I had mentioned wanting to use this, potentially wanting to use this holder to hold the dig servo. That is not going to be a thing because in this configuration, nothing lines up. Flipped around, nothing lines up. I can't flip it upside down because the clearance to the drive shaft is near minimal, and that's at full droop. All the way up, it basically touches the bottom of the servo. So that's right out. We can't use that. That moves us on to the factory bracket for it, which hits there, which means the servo will also hit. So I haven't committed to it yet, but I'm probably going to have to grind off here, or at least make a cut in for the servo, which would sit about like that-ish. I don't know how far in I could potentially move it. In Little Yella with the 550, I had to move it back. Now I'm wondering, can I remake this bracket shorter? It doesn't look like I can make it much shorter, but it doesn't need to be much shorter. If I can eat up that 4 or 5 millimeters right there and move this in a little tighter, I would prefer that over cutting into this plate. What else? Spur Gear. It might not look like it's been replaced, but I discarded the metal one. This is a Kimbrough 90-tooth machined Delrin spur gear. I'm a big fan of the Kimbrough gears. I know I had mentioned previously that the gear reduction in this is not huge because the Ecto's pretty fast on a 1200, but what I neglected to take into consideration with this is portals. So I made a little silver mark on there, and if you notice, if I turn this one full revolution, the tire just barely moves. I did the low-tech method of just turning it until a spot on the hex made a 360-degree revolution. It is 21 revolutions of the spur gear to 1 revolution of the tire, meaning this being a 90-tooth spur. If I were to put an 18-tooth pinion on there, 5-to-1, that's 105 revolutions of the motor to 1 revolution of the tire. Now, I think conceivably the largest pinion that will fit on there will be somewhere in the upper 20s. So I could get around-ish, probably get it down to about 4-to-1, 3.75-to-1 ratio pinion to spur. Then multiply that times 21. There's nothing I can do about the 21. That's due to the ratio in the portals. So this thing will be twirling along and these will barely be moving. So I ordered a 2850 KV, the copperhead with the slate. Went with the 2850 for this because because the next step up is 1,000 over that. I think 3,800 would be too much. So I'm hoping I made a good pick with the 2850 and that I can get the gearing to where I can get enough wheel speed to make this thing move. As I mentioned, I think I have the rear shocks pretty much straight up and down. I did not adjust the length of the uppers, so it still has a fairly significant pinion angle, but because how high this output is for the dig, I think that's actually okay. Because what happens at full droop, if I turn the wheels, you hear that? Well, I mean, how can you not hear the clunk? It's very rough trying to turn it from the wheel, not from the pinion. So I'm hoping that once a motor is in place, it won't be an issue. But so far as I can tell, what is happening is the rear drive shaft is at the limit of the angle that it can do. Because if I move this up like this, it turns nice and smooth. Drop it down here. So, after all the machine work I did, there's still the possibility that it might end up being element or axial drive shafts on here if, once this gets power to it, if that turns out to be an issue. I don't want to mix, so they'll both get replaced. I think I've found a front bumper and I'm at least sort of pleased with. I 3D printed this from a file that I found, and then I built the attachment method out of some, I don't know what bumper these are from, little piece of aluminum. I don't have, it's not retained in any way now because I didn't feel like it needed to be. The part that I printed, it came with a standoff section, which is offset, which I really like because I can raise or lower the bumper. So that would fit in there like that. What I didn't notice about it was that this is the bumper mount from a Red Cat, a Wendigo. So those pins are very big, and those pins are very small. These are 9mm pins, and these are 7.5. But it was not a complete loss because it allowed me to drill through this to make all of the holes for this guy, so I knew everything was going to fit. The bumper makes me feel like the body sits a little high, but I don't think it actually does because it's still going to get a little bit of rub, full lock, full compression. Only in the front. The rear seems to clear just fine, and I don't know. The stance of it is pretty good. Like I say, been working on element rigs here for a while, so everything I'm working on this seems unnaturally high. Today, I would like to perhaps get some sort of something for the rear sorted out. I'd at least like to have some shackles to hang on there, something to fill this gap. I might just replicate what I did in the front, and I would at least like to get started on getting these servos retained so that they're not just flopping all over the place all the time. I think I'm going to start with the mount for the dig servo. I'm sure that somewhere in here I have a brushless 540 motor sitting somewhere, and I will get that and pop it into place as a placeholder to see if I can in fact shorten this at all, or if the length of the can sets where that servo is going to be. I suppose there's also the option of just moving it up a little bit I mean, I could move it up a lot and mount the servo horn upside down, but I would prefer to keep it down here as low as possible. If I could get it basically right there, that would be the dream. I don't know if that's possible, but I'm going to find out once I dig through my motor bin and see if I have something to act as a placeholder. So that's where it sits right now. I'm going to make an effort to do a bit of aluminum work today to try to get this thing a little more solid. An ancient Tacon 3650 3200 kV has shown me very quickly that not only will the servo fit in the gap between the motor and that chassis piece, but because there's so much overhang at the front of the front bracket, I think I can grind that off, put a hole right there, and hopefully reuse this bracket, because as I say, it only needs to move forward really that much, 3 millimeters. So hopefully I can drill this bracket. I have two of them because I couldn't use the one on the Ecto. So hopefully I can re-drill this bracket and reuse it. That would be the dream, so long as the fasteners to hold the servo in place will clear. So that will be task number one. I'm gonna get on that right now. Successful successes are successful. As you can see here, we've got my favorite Blitz rod ends with the ball studs, little Lunsford in there. It fits perfectly. The amount of space, I mean, that's cutting it close to the edit. I have to use about half the size of spacer that it came with, but the linkage sits almost, I would love for it to be, perfectly level, but that's one of the shorter servo horns that I could find to get it sit right there, and I think it looks fine. You might also notice the drive shafts are off again, and as soon as I reposition this camera, I will explain why. All right, so at the bottom, we have a TRX4 drive shaft. See the mini splines there. In the middle here, we have an Element, and at the top here, we have an axial. Could be from Capra, could be from an SCX-10.3, could be from an SCX-10.2. They're pretty much all the same across the board. So, where the issue becomes is, here's a fairly generic example of a 3-gear gearbox. This would be an SCX-10.2 gearbox, which this was Mutation's old gearbox. So, you got an idler, you got the top shaft, and you got the main gear. Where a differential would be in something, say, two-wheel drive, like a Traxxas Slash or a Rustler or a Bandit, any of those things. Their 3 gears are almost identical to this. So, when you have a 3-gear gearbox, you're going to have a big gear down here at the bottom. And the drive shaft is going to come out of the middle of that gear. So the drive shaft comes out very high up out of the gearbox. So, to take that into account, you need a drive shaft that can deflect enough to overcome that increased height of the gearbox. So, some may or may not know, the TRX4 is essentially designed around a 2-speed gearbox. And in a 2-speed, there's an intermediate shaft. So, if this were a TRX4 gearbox, this shaft would come in and go way over here. Then there's a gear here. And then that gear comes down and drives a gear here, which is driving another shaft which has 2 gears on it. So, for the low and the high. That shaft being driven by that gear, because this big gear has bearings in it, This shaft will go through to the transfer case, which reduces it down, and then the two gears come out of the Traxxas transmission, and they come out like that, like all the way at the bottom of the gearbox. Therefore, a Traxxas drive shaft, as the output shafts are so close to the bottom, they don't need to deflect as much. So there's the maximum amount of deflection you can get out of a TRX4 drive shaft compared to the deflection you can get out of an axial type drive shaft, which is, that's near 45 degrees. This is maybe 30 degrees. So it's not just a matter of fitment. It's a matter of this is not designed to work with this. It just isn't. Unless you don't have drivetrain angle. So I'm now at the part where I have to get a drive shaft in place for axles and a gearbox not intended to go in this chassis. So I'm going through all the bins trying to get a front and rear drive shaft of the correct length. And this is the rear Traxxas that I pulled off, which is very short. That would typically be like what you would see on the front on a TRX4, and it might actually have a long upper. Like it might be like that. So I have to dig through all of these pieces, and there's more over here, and there's more over here, until I can assemble two drive shafts using whatever center. I already know, but the element inners, that's a rear for element, and this is a front. They're both too long. Like, this one will almost work in the front. This one is too long for the front and the rear. This one's too long for the rear. So with the axial shafts, I have some shorter internal pieces. So I'm going to have to dig through those until I can assemble a drive shaft long enough, short enough to fit in the rear without binding. Because as you can see, it's pretty short. And basically when you're assembling a drive shaft, you want, if this end is bolted up, you want the other end to be just shy of the end of the shaft, so you stretch it over. Because this thing is already getting a little jigsaw puzzly. Like, to get the servo, I have to mount the servo to the bracket and then bolt the bracket to the gearbox. And in order to bolt the bracket to the gearbox, the motor has to be out. Otherwise, you can't access the screws. So it has to go that into that, and then that onto that, and then that goes in. So I'm not a huge fan of puzzle piecing things together. Who is? But everything clears just perfectly. And because of the shape of the way the transmission sits and the shape of the chassis, as you can see, that is on it. That is a 19-tooth pinion gear on there. So that is about, like, I could maybe fit a 20. So 2090 would be the best I could do with this spur. But I have plenty of options in spurs. I could go to 32 pitch. I could change the top shaft out to an element top shaft, or anyone who's using hexed or splined. I would rather just use this because I have it, and I do love a machined Delrin spur. They're very quiet. That's finishing stuff. So I did check the Taycan against the Castle motor. They are the exact same length. They are proper 540s. I do have, I don't know, 2 millimeters of space in there. This guy is nestled right in here real nice. I don't know if I'm going to get to this at this juncture. It's more about getting the drive shafts set up so that this thing will work smoothly. And I'm going to get back to trying to piecemeal a pair of drive shafts together, because I would rather not cut these way down. I do have 2 rigs using element drive shafts, and it's nice to have a little spare stuff laying around. So whatever I can get fitted without machining will be great. And hopefully I can get those on and give you a look at that. So in an effort to wrap up today's episode of Drive Shaft Shenanigans Theater, this is the shaft and end from an axial. And this is the shaft and end from an element. As you see, they are virtually identical, and they're interchangeable, except for that part. The end caps fit both exactly the same, and they use the same size pivot barrels, that little guy that rolls away. They use the same ones of that, and they use the same pins. Both of these, the external diameter of that is just under 11 millimeters, so they use the same pins, they use the same everything. Number 3 to the party, this is Traxxas. And if you'll see, the Traxxas is shorter, it's got that chunky neck, and it uses different size hardware all around. So these Traxxas ends will fit in these shafts, but not vice versa. So once again, Traxxas fits in Traxxas and nothing else. Also, these little end guys are essentially the same across axial and element, but the element ones are about 1 millimeter longer. So when you have these parts, what I call the hats that hold them on, there you have an axial hat, 1335, and here you have an element hat, 7/10 of a millimeter. That 7/10 of a millimeter means one will fit on one, but not on the other. What that leaves us with is drive shafts that are some kind of horrible amalgam. The way this gearbox sits in this chassis is essentially now a rear drive shaft on the front and a front drive shaft on the rear. I did end up having to turn the center shaft down on that one to get it to fit. It has that much play in it, which is about all you need, that about 4 millimeters. The front has a little bit more. It managed to fit without too much manipulation, but I can tell you from here, I don't know what parts are what. I know that these parts and the fluted parts are axial on both, but as far as the ends go, I'm pretty sure these castle type ones are element. That's just what I happen to go with. And the clearance right there is 0 clearance. When I tried assembling it with the axial pins, which are these little chrome guys, they have a couple too many threads. So when that rotated around, when that rotated right there, it would hit the motor mount plate and just stop. I also tried this rear one. As I had mentioned before, the front really seats into that bearing, but you can see right there, that castled bit is just clearing. And these other ones that have the notch cut in them are, I guess, just the tiniest bit bigger around because it was rubbing. So I couldn't use that one in the front, so I was going to use the same one in the rear. The rear needs to cut out one because the bearing comes out all the way. And the regular end, like that, wouldn't clear. That would be mushed up against the bearing and just completely stop it. So I think there's one little bit of Samix in there because Zoidberg the Capra is so stretched that he's basically using the long ones all the way around from 2 sets. So there's some pieces of this Samix set on Colonel Mustard, the SCX-10-3, and now there's a piece on here. It's kind of been distributed out among the fleet. I had mentioned initially I thought that pinion angle was too steep. Now I don't think that it is. I thought the rear drive shaft angle was going to be the wacky one, but it's actually pretty good. And the front drive shaft angle is now the one that's going to require, because that is some zero clearance right there. I am probably going to have to end up using Element because they're skinny. I think they're only 5 millimeter outside diameter. Couldn't use a turnbuckle because the knuckle would be right there. So I am going to go about switching out, off camera, mind you, switching out all the rod ends and the lower links, and potentially all the upper links as well, because the front upper is dialed out pretty well, and it needs to be dialed out more because you see how far that comes down below. And then on this, nice and clean in the back. So if it messes up the caster a little, I think I'm okay with it, because I would like this drive shaft to be tucked up inside the links a bit better than it is right now. So in the interim period between this video and the next, I will be cleaning that up before I get to the really troublesome part of the trouble I've made for myself in mounting those two so they can stop flopping around. But this transmission is in, and boy, is it smooth. As it's set right now, it's just under 100 to 1, which is a bit excessive. I really don't want to cut into that C channel in an effort to get the motor over anymore, but no point in cutting until I see how it runs with like an 18-19 tooth pinion in there. So this, and when I say this, I mean what I was involved in today. This apocalypse, this drive shaft apocalypse that I've been going on in several hours to get to where I am now. So I don't know if I have much left in me for today. So that's all this one is going to be. This episode is essentially getting the dig mount, which went super easy and got that done, and then fiddling with drive shafts, which took hours. But I can't say I'm not happy with the outcome. Yeah, so now I think just looking at it right there, much better rear drive shaft angle, front drive shaft angle, not so good. But I have to find, obviously, longer links before I can mess with that. So it'll be a lot of punching out hollow balls, and people want to watch it less than I want to do it. So that'll do it for this one. That's part 3 wrapped up. I do thank you very much for watching, and sincerely hope that you'll tune in for the next one. Thanks.